The Vethani bioscan returned 3 separate error codes before the technician gave up and called her supervisor. The supervisor ran it again, same result. She stood there for a long moment staring at the display, and then looked at the man sitting on the examination table, with his hands folded in his lap and his expression somewhere between patient and mildly apologetic, as if the machine's confusion were somehow his fault, and he felt badly about it. "It's not broken," she said. "I know," said Gareth Nolan. "It did the same thing on the shuttle." The supervisor, a Vethani named Isavrel, her rank markings etched along her collar in a pattern that indicated she had seen considerably more than a standard bioscan malfunction in her career, looked at the readout one more time, then looked at Gareth, then set the scanner down with the particular careful precision of someone choosing not to throw it. "Stay here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere," Gareth said. And then, because it was true, "I'm just here for the maintenance contract." Nobody had expected Gareth Nolan to be the one dispatched to Vethani Station Corellis. That much was clear even before the assignment came through. He was 34 years old, a mid-level environmental systems technician for a small contracting firm out of Thunder Bay, and he had been sent because the 2 engineers above him had both declined the posting, for reasons their supervisor had not shared with him, but which Gareth suspected involved the word Vethani appearing prominently in the job description. The Vethani were not known for their warmth toward coalition species. They were known for their precision, their territorial nature, and a bioscan protocol at every entry point that could detect organic compounds at a molecular level and had, according to the briefing materials Gareth had read on the transit, flagged 17 separate incidents of contraband in the past 8 months. It had not apparently been designed to flag error. The maintenance contract itself was straightforward on paper: 3 weeks aboard Corellis to assess and repair the station's secondary atmospheric circulation system, which had developed an intermittent fault that the Vethani's own engineers had been unable to isolate. The fault was not dangerous. It was, however, deeply irritating to a species whose environmental tolerances ran to precise calibrations, and irritation had translated into a contract being offered to coalition contractors when internal solutions failed. Gareth's firm had won the bid. Gareth's firm had then immediately discovered that both of its senior engineers had scheduling conflicts. Gareth had been handed a duffel bag, a data pad with the technical schematics, and a travel voucher with 48 hours' notice. He was used to that kind of thing. He had cleared 4 security checkpoints between the shuttle bay and the examination room, each one progressively more thorough, each staffed by Vethani personnel who had processed his documents with the smooth efficiency of people who did this dozens of times a day and expected no surprises. The bioscan at Checkpoint 3 had been the first interruption. The technician there had run it twice, cross-referenced his coalition transit documentation, and then waved him through with an expression that suggested she was going to file a maintenance report about the scanner immediately after her shift. The bioscan at Checkpoint 4 had produced the same errors, and this time they had taken him aside. Isavrel returned 11 minutes later with a second supervisor. The second supervisor was taller, older, with the kind of steady, unhurried movement that came from authority that did not need to announce itself. She introduced herself as Prelate Inspector Vanathoris. Her rank, Gareth's datapad informed him later when he thought to check, was roughly equivalent to a senior investigative officer. The fact that she was handling a routine bioscan anomaly suggested that the anomaly had been escalated fairly rapidly through several layers of station hierarchy. "Mr. Nolan," she said, "you are here for the atmospheric contract." "That's right. Walk me through your transit documentation." He did. She listened without interrupting, which he appreciated, and when he finished she asked 3 follow-up questions about his firm's credentials that he answered accurately and completely because he had nothing to hide, and because lying to a Vethani prelate inspector on her own station seemed like the kind of decision a person did not get to make twice. "The scanner is not malfunctioning," she said when he finished. "It was not a question. I figured. It flagged the same codes on the last one. Are you aware of any medical conditions or implants that might interfere with biological scanning?" Gareth thought about it honestly. "No implants. I had a knee reconstruction 7 years ago, but that's standard coalition hardware. I've been through probably 200 bioscans since then without any issues." Vanathoris looked at him for a long, assessing moment. She had pale gray eyes with horizontal pupils, a Vethani characteristic, and they were directed at him with the focused attention of someone genuinely puzzled by what they were seeing, or rather, not seeing. "The scanner is reading your biological signature," she said carefully. but it cannot classify it. Every organism we have on record produces a coefficient pattern that falls within predictable parameters for its species. Yours does not fit the parameters for human. It does not fit the parameters for any species on record." She paused. "It reads as something we do not have a category for." Gareth looked at his own hands for a moment. They looked entirely normal to him. They were, as far as he had ever known, entirely normal. He was a man from northern Ontario who fixed ventilation systems and made decent pasta, and had once memorably fixed a cascading fault in a Coalition Medical Station's cooling system in 40 minutes with a wrench and some electrical tape while 3 certified engineers watched. He had no explanation for that either, now that he thought about it. "I don't know what to tell you," he said. "I'm just a technician." The words landed in the room and sat there. Vaneth Oris turned to Isavrel and said something in rapid Vethani that Gareth's basic translator did not fully catch, but which included the words for analysis, secondary lab, and what his translator rendered as the quiet kind of problem. He was moved to a secondary examination room. It was still a room, not a cell, and he was offered water and something that resembled a nutrient bar, which he ate because he hadn't had anything since the shuttle, and his stomach had opinions about that. They left him alone for 40 minutes. He used the time to review the atmospheric schematics on his datapad, because the fault pattern was still interesting to him, and he had a working theory about an intermittent pressure differential in the tertiary intake manifold that he wanted to cross-reference before he got anywhere near the actual equipment. When Vaneth Oris returned, she had 2 people with her who were not station security. They were wearing different uniforms, lighter, with the blue and white trim that Gareth associated vaguely with Vethani scientific personnel. One of them was carrying a different kind of scanner, something Gareth didn't recognize. "We would like to run some additional tests," Vaneth Oris said. "With your permission." He noted that she had asked. "Sure," he said. "Molecular spectral imaging, neurological resonance mapping, a cellular differentiation panel." She watched his face. "They are non-invasive." "Okay." He set his datapad down. "How long?" 2 hours, possibly 3. He thought about his intake manifold theory. He thought about the fact that he had a 3-week contract and the fault wasn't going anywhere. He thought about the fact that a Vethani prelate inspector was currently looking at him with the expression of someone who had encountered something they didn't have a word for. "Go ahead," he said. The tests took 2 hours and 40 minutes. The scientists, their names were something close to Thivrin and Ossel, or at least that was what his translator gave him, did not speak to him much while they worked, which he was fine with. They moved with the careful, deliberate efficiency of people who were taking this seriously, exchanging brief comments in Vethani that his translator caught fragments of consistent, anomalous, no known analog. At one point, Thivrin set a scanner down and simply stared at its readout for almost a full minute without moving. "Is there a problem?" Gareth asked. "No," Thivrin said, and then after a pause that stretched a little too long, "You are quite unusual." "People have mentioned that," Gareth said. "Not in the way I expect people mean when they say it to you." He had no response to that. When Vaneth Oris came back in, both scientists were standing near the primary display terminal with their notes, and the energy in the room had changed in a way Gareth could feel without being able to precisely quantify. There was the particular charged stillness of people who had found something they did not expect to find, and were not entirely sure what to do with it. "Mr. Nolan," Vaneth Oris said. She had the tone of someone choosing words with more than usual care. "I would like to ask you some questions about your health history, if you are willing." "Sure. Have you ever been seriously injured?" Gareth thought. "Dislocated shoulder about 6 years ago. Hairline fracture in 2 fingers from a pressure seal accident. Concussion in my early 20s. Minor. Standard stuff for the kind of work I do." "Recovery times?" "He's normal. I think maybe fast sometimes. The shoulder was supposed to take 6 weeks. I was back at work in 3. He paused. "My doctor mentioned it." Vaneth Oris made a note. "Have you ever been exposed to high radiation environments? Cleared for standard EVA. Nothing above threshold. Extreme temperature?" "I worked a posting on Harov Station 3 years ago. The exterior maintenance runs were cold. But I was in a suit. Did the cold affect you?" "Not really. I was told afterwards the suit's insulation had partially failed and the external temps had been around -90 Celsius. He paused. "I hadn't noticed. I thought the suit was working fine." Both scientists had stopped writing. "You did not notice," Vaneth Oris said. "I noticed it was a bit chilly," Gareth said. "I thought the thermostat was off." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the previous silences. Voneth Oris looked at the scientists. Osil looked at the display. Thivrin looked at Gareth with the expression of someone recalibrating something fundamental. Mr. Nolan, Voneth Oris said, "Are you aware that the cold tolerance you just described falls approximately 4 times outside the survivable range for unassisted humans?" "That seems like a lot," Gareth said. "It is a great deal." He looked at his hands again. They were the same hands he'd had his whole life. A bit rough, a scar on the left thumb from a panel edge incident in 2031, knuckles that cracked in cold weather. Normal hands as far as he had ever been able to tell. "I genuinely don't know what to tell you," he said. "I've always run a bit cold. My mom said the same thing about herself." Nobody wrote anything for a moment. "Your mother," Voneth Oris said. "She grew up in Labrador. She always said the winters didn't bother her as much as they should." He paused. "She's a librarian, retired." He was not sure why he had added that last part. It seemed relevant to something, though he couldn't have said what. Voneth Oris looked at the display one more time, then back at him. Something had shifted in the way she was watching him. Not suspicion, not quite, but a kind of careful recalibration of her assumptions that was visible if you knew where to look. Gareth had spent his career learning to read rooms, partly because it was useful, and partly because he had grown up as the kind of person rooms were arranged around without ever being the center of them, and he had learned to watch rather than be watched. "The atmospheric contract," she said eventually. "Still need to do it," he said. "The fault's not going to fix itself, no." She considered him. "The intake manifold series, I understand, has been resistant to diagnosis. I have a theory about that. Pressure differential in the tertiary intake. It's intermittent because it's tied to the station's rotation cycle. The fault only presents at a specific angular position relative to the docking array. You'd miss it with a standard diagnostic sweep unless you were timing it correctly." She looked at him. "I read the schematics on the shuttle," he said. "You diagnosed an intermittent atmospheric fault that our engineering team has been working on for 6 weeks," she said, "while waiting in a room under medical review. I had the data pad. I had time." He paused. "I could be wrong. I'd want to check in person before I said anything definitive." She was quiet for another moment. It was, he noticed, the same kind of quiet that Caleb Reyes had produced in a different hangar, a different station, breaking different restraints. The quiet of someone confronting a fact that did not slot neatly into any existing framework. He would not have known that. He did not think about it in those terms. What he thought was that the room felt like it was waiting for something, and that he was probably the something it was waiting for, and that the most useful thing he could do was stay calm and not do anything dramatic. He was, in general, good at that. "Mr. Nolan," Voneth Oris said, "I have been the prelate inspector of Corellis for 11 years. In that time I have processed documentation for approximately 14,000 coalition visitors." "That's a lot of people." "It is." She paused. "You are the first one the bioscan has declined to classify." He did not know what to say to that, so he didn't say anything. "We will conclude the medical review for today," she said. "You will be assigned quarters and escorted to the atmospheric systems bay in the morning. We would like, with your continued cooperation, to conduct some further analysis over the course of your contract period. Non-invasive. At your convenience." "That's fine," he said. "One question before you go." She held his gaze steadily. "And I am asking in genuine inquiry, not in any official capacity. When you pulled against the -90°C, when your shoulder healed in 3 weeks, when the scanner cannot find a category for you," she tilted her head just slightly, "what do you think you are?" The question sat in the air between them. Gareth thought about it honestly, the way he did most things. He thought about his mother and her winters. He thought about the shoulder, and the fingers, and the cold suit at Hariv that he had reported as a minor thermostat issue and which had apparently been something else entirely. He thought about the intake manifold theory, which had come to him in about 20 minutes of reading, because the fault pattern was not actually that subtle, if you knew what to look for, and which he suspected the Vethani engineers had missed because they were looking for mechanical failure rather than a systemic timing issue. He thought about being the third choice for this posting, the person sent because everyone else had a reason not to go. "I'm a technician," he said. "A pretty good one, I think. Beyond that, I genuinely couldn't say." She studied him the way she had studied everything else in the room, carefully, without hurry, with the particular attention of someone whose job it was to find the truth of things. "I believe you," she said. "I find that somewhat more unsettling than if you were lying." He almost smiled. "That's fair." He was shown to his quarters by a station officer who introduced himself as Trevith, and who walked the entire route without saying anything else, which Gareth was fine with because he used the transit time to think through the manifold problem and what tools he'd need from the kit he'd brought. The room was small and precise in the Vethani way. Every surface functional, every angle intentional, the kind of space that communicated efficiency rather than comfort. But that was, underneath it all, entirely livable if you weren't particular about decoration. He'd stayed in worse. He'd stayed in a lot worse. He sat on the edge of the sleeping surface and looked at his hands for the third time that day. He had always healed fast. He had always run cold. He had always found fault patterns in systems before other people noticed them. Not because he was brilliant, he didn't think that, but because he paid attention to things that other people had decided were not worth paying attention to. The panel that was vibrating slightly differently than the others, the temperature reading that was a quarter degree off what the system expected, the rotation cycle that nobody had thought to map against the diagnostic timing. Small things, ordinary things, things that required nothing more than patience and the willingness to sit with a datapad in a waiting room for 40 minutes, while officials argued about what category you belonged to. He set the datapad on the surface beside him and turned off the light. The Vethani station hummed around him with the precise mechanical breath of a well-maintained system. He could hear, very faintly, what might have been the tertiary intake manifold cycling through its rotation, just the edge of a frequency that the station's insulation was almost, but not quite, dampening fully. He would check that in the morning. He had a feeling it was going to tell him something useful. The fault was found in the intake manifold on the 4th day of Gareth's contract, exactly where he had theorized it would be, at an angular offset of approximately 17 degrees from the docking array alignment that the Vethani engineers had been using as their reference baseline. The fault was not a mechanical failure. It was a calibration drift in the pressure monitoring sensor that had shifted incrementally over 14 months of operation, too slowly to trigger any automated alert, too subtle to appear on a standard diagnostic sweep unless the sweep was timed to the station's specific rotation cycle at the specific angular position where the drift became measurable. It took Gareth 3 days to fully characterize it, and another 4 to implement the correction, working in the atmospheric bay with 2 Vethani systems. Engineers named Aveth and Dralin, who said very little to him in the first 2 days, and progressively more in the days that followed, in the way of people who do not trust easily, but cannot argue with results. On the 6th day, Dralin handed him a secondary calibration tool without being asked, having correctly anticipated that he was about to reach for one. On the 7th day, Aveth told him, apparently without meaning to, that the atmospheric section had not had a coalition contractor complete a diagnostic correctly in 4 previous attempts. What went wrong with the others? Gareth asked. They looked for mechanical failure, Aveth said. He paused. They did not look at the timing. The timing's the first thing I'd check, Gareth said. Aveth looked at him for a moment. Yes, he said. We understand that now. Vonathoris found him on the 8th day in the atmospheric bay, running a final validation sequence while the station's rotation carried the intake array through the corrected calibration cycle. She stood at the entrance for a moment before he noticed her, and when he turned she had the expression of someone who had decided to say something they had been thinking about for several days. The analysis results from the medical team, she said. I figured that was coming. She came further into the bay and stood at a comfortable distance. Close enough for conversation, far enough for the kind of conversation that needed room around it. They found nothing pathological, she said. No disease process, no implant, no anomalous external factor. What they found instead was a series of biological efficiencies that your own coalition medicine does not appear to have documented. She paused. Your cells repair faster than the human baseline. Your thermal regulation operates at a range that human physiology should not be able to sustain. Your neurological processing speed for spatial and systems analysis is elevated by a significant margin. I've always been good with systems, Mr. Nolan. Her voice was patient. The margin is not small. He set the calibration tool down. What does that mean? That is, in fact, the question. She looked at him steadily. Our science team wants to flag this through coalition scientific channels. Standard protocol for anomalous biological findings. They believe other researchers would want to know. She paused. I wanted to inform you before that happens. He thought about it. Not anxiously. Anxiety wasn't particularly useful information. He thought about it the way he thought about fault patterns. What was actually known, what was actually unknown, what the timing was, and what came next. My mother, he said. Yes, if it's genetic, she'd be part of this too. Potentially. Coalition researchers would want to trace the lineage. She held his gaze. It would be up to you how much of that you were willing to share. She's a retired librarian in Labrador, he said. She feeds birds in the winter. She's never liked being cold, but she has never not been able to stand it. She thought everyone was like that. Very few people are like that, Vonathoris said quietly. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? He said. Yes, the 19 other contractors who've been through here. The ones the bioscan classified fine. The ones who fit the parameters. He looked at her. What happened with them? Were they good at their jobs? She considered the question. Some were. Some were adequate. The atmospheric contract had not been successfully completed before you, but the previous attempts were not all poor work. The fault was genuinely difficult to locate, because nobody timed it to the rotation cycle, because nobody thought to. He nodded slowly. He looked around the atmospheric bay, at the intake array, at the calibration panels, at the precise mechanical environment that had been producing an intermittent error for 14 months because everyone who looked at it had looked for the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time. The bioscan thing, he said. The fact that it couldn't classify me, does that bother you? Personally? Vonathoris was quiet for a moment before she answered. It interests me, she said, which is not the same as bothering me. She paused. In 11 years, this station has operated on the assumption that we understand the parameters of everything that passes through it. That is a useful assumption. It makes things run efficiently. Another pause. You have made me question whether efficiency and accuracy are always the same thing. They're usually not, he said. In atmospheric systems, anyway, I suspect, she said, that the principle extends beyond atmospheric systems. He picked the calibration tool back up. The rotation cycle was completing. He had another 20 minutes of validation data to collect before the sequence was done. He had 3 weeks on this contract, and he was ahead of schedule, which meant he had time to do the final work properly. When the coalition researchers contact me, he said, not quite a question, they will. Will you be involved? She looked at him with the same careful assessing focus she had directed at him since the first examination room, except that something in it had shifted. Not softened exactly, but changed in the specific way of a person who has encountered an unexpected thing and decided to be curious about it rather than unsettled. I have already requested to be present for that conversation, she said. Good, he said. He meant it straightforwardly, the way he meant most things. She stood there for another moment, watching the calibration sequence run. You are a strange man, Mr. Nolan, she said, without unkindness. I've been told, he said. Usually after I fix something people thought was unfixable. And does that bother you? He thought about it honestly. He thought about the shoulder that healed in 3 weeks. He thought about the cold that wasn't cold. He thought about 14 months of a fault that presented at a specific rotation angle. That everyone who had looked had been looking at slightly wrong, and how the solution had come to him in a waiting room with a data pad and 40 minutes because he had simply looked at what was actually there rather than what he expected to find. Not especially, he said. I'm usually more interested in the next problem. Vonathoris made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was something adjacent to it. The next problem, she said, is that your rotation validation will be 11 minutes off schedule if you keep talking. He had not told her how long the validation sequence took. He looked at the timing display. She was correct, to the minute. You've been reviewing the schematics, he said. I reviewed them this morning, she said. I wanted to understand what you were doing. He looked at the display, then back at her. Did you find it interesting? I found it elegant, she said. The solution is simple once you know where to look. Most solutions are. She nodded once, the kind of nod that carried weight, and turned to leave. At the bay entrance, she paused. There will be a formal report filed through coalition channels within the week. You will be contacted. Another pause. I hope you will be patient with the process. Coalition bureaucracy moves at its own pace. I've been dealing with coalition contractors my whole career, Gareth said. I have plenty of patience. Yes, she said. I imagine you do. She left him to the calibration sequence and the quiet hum of the intake array completing its cycle. The validation data came back clean. Every sensor within tolerance, every pressure coefficient exactly where it should be, the rotation-dependent fault corrected and stable, and no longer producing the intermittent readings that had frustrated an entire engineering team for over a year. He logged the results, annotated the methodology for the Vethani systems record, and packed up his kit with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done this kind of work in a lot of different rooms. The atmospheric system would keep running. The station would not notice the difference consciously, the way bodies do not consciously notice when a slow-building fault is finally cleared. But the numbers would be exactly right from now on, and in systems work, numbers that were exactly right was the whole point. He was 3 days ahead of schedule. He sat with his datapad in the quiet of the atmospheric bay and thought about his mother's winters. He thought about whether she had ever been bioscanned at a Vethani checkpoint. He thought about whether she had ever noticed, in her particular quiet way, that the world sometimes fit her differently than it seemed to fit everyone else. That the cold was not quite as cold. That injuries resolved in ways that surprised the people around her. That she looked at problems from angles that other people hadn't thought to try. She was a librarian. She organized information for a living. She had always been good at finding things in places other people had stopped looking. He made a note to call her when he got back within Coalition relay range. The Coalition science team reached him 6 weeks after he returned from Corellis, exactly as Vaneth Oris had predicted. There were 3 of them on the initial call, a human researcher, a Vethani analyst, and a Korathi biophysicist. And they were professional and careful and clearly very interested, in the restrained way of scientists who had taught themselves not to lead with excitement before the data was complete. He answered their questions. He gave them his medical history. He arranged a follow-up for his mother, who listened to the whole explanation with the particular calm of someone who had always privately suspected something of the sort, asked 3 precise and thoughtful questions, and said that she supposed they had better find out what was actually going on. She was, Gareth thought, a person who looked at things from angles other people hadn't considered. He came by it honestly. Vaneth Oris was present for the second research call, as she had said she would be. She said very little, but she listened with the specific quality of attention that he had come to recognize as her particular way of engaging with things. Careful, unhurried, taking in more than was immediately visible. At the end of the call, after the researchers had disconnected, she stayed on the channel for a moment. "Mr. Nolan," she said, "Miss Oris. The atmospheric system at Corellis has been running without fault for 6 weeks. Good," he said. "It should hold. The correction is stable." Yes. A pause. "There is a second contract. A pressure regulation issue in the thermal exchange array. Our engineers have been unable to locate the fault." He thought about it for about 3 seconds. "Send me the schematics," he said. She did. He found the fault in the data before he even booked the transit. It was a harmonic resonance issue in the exchange coupling, the kind of thing that only presented under specific thermal load conditions, and that you would miss entirely unless you thought to cross-reference the load data against the coupling's resonance frequency at the relevant temperatures. Nobody had thought to cross-reference. He booked the transit. The bioscan at Corellis on his second arrival returned the same 3 error codes as before. The technician this time did not call a supervisor. She had a note in her system. She stamped his documentation, said "Welcome back, Mr. Nolan," and waved him through. He walked into the station with his duffel bag and his datapad and his working theory about the thermal exchange coupling, the same as he always had. The same as he had always been, unremarkable in all the ways that did not matter, and apparently extraordinary in all the ways that had simply never been measured before. The station hummed. The systems ran. Somewhere in the thermal exchange array, a coupling was producing a resonance that nobody else had thought to listen for. He had always been good at hearing things like that.